Hello and welcome to the new episode of All Opinions Welcome. Today's guest is Simon Evans, a multi-award-winning stand-up comedian whose show Genius was awarded 5 stars at Edinburgh and called a masterclass in socio-political comedy. He's written loads and loads for television, from Lily Savage to 8 out of 10 Cats, but the most amazing thing about him is that he's not afraid to take the mickey out of Remainers and Brexiteers. He's a rare beast, a comedian who doesn't feel the need to toe the politically correct line. So,
hello,
Simon. Hello, mate. Now, we know each other, don't we? And we have for some time.
We go back quite a long way, with a lacuna, I think, in the middle, a long, brief pause. 25 years ago, I think we were at the same journalism college. Yeah.
Which mainly involved hanging around the coach and horses and dodging lecturers.
Which, to be fair, was what most of the Guardian journalists were doing as well in the same part of town. Near the Eagle in Farringdon, wasn't it?
Correct. But since then, you've come on leaps and bounds, it's fair to say. And one thing that stuck out was that Rod Liddell once described you as Britain's only right-wing comedian. Now, how do you feel about that?
I had to struggle back to my feet after that. It's not considered to be a badge of honour in the community, but I suppose in that respect, that's precisely the point he was making. It is quite unusual. I mean, I wouldn't say I was the only one. There are 2 or 3. And I wouldn't exactly say I was right-wing either, as you kind of indicated. My intention is to be even-handed or to float other possibilities. But
it does seem to be the case, does it not?
Yeah.
That most comedians seem to be very lefty, liberal, sanctimonious, could we say? I mean,
well, I don't want to tar them with sanctimonious. I mean, we might privately agree on that. I've made a programme for Radio 4 about this recently, ironically enough, but they did broadcast it. But the point I was making in that was that there's been, a very long history, of course, of comedy speaking truth to power. If you want to be pretentious about it, you could say it goes back to King Lear and his fool, on the heath, telling him that he's been an idiot to give his kingdom away. But something happened around the time of the sort of Alexis Earle, Ben Elton era, where everyone swung massively to the left, and it became a real us and them mentality with Thatcher and so on. And then there was a sort of period of cooling off of the sort of political heat during the Blair era. Yeah. And during that time, I think a sort of political consensus settled on the comedy community without them really realising it, which made them, rightly or wrongly, very much pro-Remain. And so when you had the Brexit referendum, mocked the week endlessly, mocked only one side of that argument. Nigel Farage was essentially burned in effigy on every single night of every single programme, and there were hardly any satirical jabs made about the ambitions of a supranational organisation which attempted to combine us into a federal state of Europe, or the German banks and their dealings with the Greek austerity programme. None of that was satirised to the same level that the absurd Little Englander mindset of the UKIP people.
And why do you think that is? And do you think, in a sense, that Brexit's been a terrible thing for British comedy?
Well, I don't know about a terrible thing, but it certainly exposed fault lines that might have been more comfortably left buried. I don't think anyone really benefits from seeing anything flayed while still alive. You like to see a certain smoothness, and people like to be able to get along. And I spend most of my life on Twitter, and because I live in Hove, and so those are the options that I have, and Hove's quiet. But I spend most of my life on Twitter. I have found myself getting drawn into Brexit debates, but I do try very hard to kind of smooth over cracks, to reach out, to reconnect, to rebond with people, however different our political opinions. But I am finding it increasingly difficult to do so, and it seems only to be a one-way street. I've got to say that. There does seem to be a really incendiary determination on the part of everyone who is pro-Remain and believes that Brexit is the project of bigots and fantasists, not to lay down, not to give up an inch, to constantly advance and to constantly present you as, it's that kind of cry-bully mentality which is becoming really tiresome. And so I do find myself increasingly expressing not so much pro-Brexit, but defending Brexit, or defending half of the country, essentially, and their democratic right to see their wishes fulfilled.
That's great. So you spend a lot of time in comedy clubs, obviously.
No, actually not that much now. I will just interrupt you there, but I don't go to comedy clubs that much. I'm more of a touring comedian now, and that's possibly a little bit of a shame, but I don't see comedy clubs that often.
But what I was going to ask you next was, what kind of flavour of jokes are there out? What are the most offensive jokes you've heard about Brexiteers and Brexit in general?
The single most offensive thing I've heard in a comedy club, is there any bar on language?
No, fire away.
Okay, the single most offensive joke, and there may be a number of comedians doing this, so I won't even need to say which one it is, But a comedian came on stage and their very first words were, "Can I just say, if you voted Brexit, will you please fuck off now?" And there was a huge cheer, presumably from everyone who voted Remain, but I can't have been the only person in the audience who just thought, and I didn't vote like Brexit, but you know, my father, who is still alive, despite the best intentions of the Remain voters who were convinced that anyone in their late 80s who voted Leave should be dead by now and no longer needs to be accorded any respect. He voted Leave. He's an intelligent man. He read the newspapers. He had, I think, a fairly decent and rational understanding of the issues in play, and he would have preferred us to scale it down to a Norwegian or Canadian style, you know. He's not like just some, I just think they should end it, you know. But this is the presentation. This is the idea. And you can say it's tongue-in-cheek, but I think it would have made everyone feel very uncomfortable. I don't think it's appropriate to start in a comedy club with something that is so hideously divisive and just cows, I don't know, maybe not 50%, maybe only 30 or 20% of the audience.
But don't you find at that point that comedians start self-censoring? Because, I mean, we hear often, don't we, about if people make jokes, like the Burger King sketch. You know, the guy who said, let's leave Burger King being like Brexit. Yeah. The work's dried up. Yeah.
I hesitate to get involved in particular cases. I thought that was a funny routine, his Burger King routine, but I hadn't heard of that comedian beforehand. I honestly don't know whether any comedy clubs have gone, no, we're not going to book him because of that. That may be I honestly don't know. Most of the comedy clubs, the ones I still play, like the Comedia in Brighton, which is just my local one, the Banana in Balham, the Comedy Store itself. There's a very good one in East London, in Bethnal Green, called Comedy Unleashed, which explicitly and specifically has a policy of booking people regardless of their political agenda.
I've been there, and that's good.
And it is good, and it's much more balanced than it sounds. It's not just people standing there going, "I'll tell you what, you can't say anything these days." You know, there's a balance of views. You know, they have. The night I was on, there was a drag act who was talking in quite a, I suppose predictable sort of, not predictable as in a bad, but a reasonable political viewpoint or whatever that might come from being a marginalised person. There's loads of variety in those kind of places. Yeah. I don't know that it's been qualmed. I feel it's more actually in terms of what comes out of broadcast comedy at the moment. How it does, it struggles to represent any kind of balance.
Our friends at the BBC, you mean? I don't see any jokes at the expense of Remainers anytime, anywhere.
It doesn't happen very often, no. Yeah. And they have regular complaints on the news quiz and so on that they, and they struggle. And so, because it's because these things are a kind of, cyclical practice. There was for a long time there used to be very few female comedians, and every time the Edinburgh Festival came around, all the broadsheet newspapers would say, are women funny? Can women be funny? Why aren't there any female comedians? And it was considered to be a perfectly well, it wouldn't be now. It's an absurd idea that women can't be funny. Of course women are funny, but part of the reason that happened is that they decided to start giving work to female comedians, many of whom, frankly, by normal standards, by other rational criteria, were not ready to appear on TV panel shows.
They weren't that funny.
They weren't that funny because they weren't that experienced. They had not done 10 years or 15 years on the circuit. They didn't have 3 or 4 hours of material under their belts. They needed writers. They needed some experience. But they were put on those shows because it was decided that they wanted to see gender balance on the shows. And I agree with that. It was fine. There were some shows which weren't as funny as they might have been. But now it has drawn it. Those female comedians themselves are funnier because they're more experienced and they're more comfortable and they feel they're surrounded by friends. There's 2 or 3. They're not like the token woman on Mock the Week. There's 2 or 3 of them. And then other women at home go, oh, I could be a comedian. It isn't just a thing that blokes and 1 or 2 deluded women try and do.
But don't you think it's fair to say that the BBC in particular is huge on diversity?
Yeah, exactly.
Of
this
gender,
is my point.
Of skin colour. What about diversity of political opinion? It seems to be bereft.
That is exactly my point. So if you are saying, well, we struggle to find right-wing or like even just Brexit-minded comedians, you're not looking for extreme hard-right comedians, but just comedians who are sceptical about Europe, then just start putting some on who aren't that, maybe aren't ready, and then you'll draw it in and then you will find. I've often been the only one who was even neutral or sceptical, let alone, on a panel. And it's hard if there's 6 of them rowing in one direction and you're just occasionally trying to jab your oar in and turn the boat around. It doesn't.
So are there any funny jokes about Brexit that you've heard?
the only material I really do about Brexit is just how laborious it is, how exhausting it is, how we're all just had enough of it, of course, which you might argue is a pro-Brexit, pro Boris Johnson, we leave on the 31st, yes, regardless kind of approach. I mean, one line I still use and that has been working for me is to the effect that it is taking longer to detach politically from Europe than it did geologically. It's it's absurd. We have, and could at least at this point switch to a news medium more appropriate to the speed of development, perhaps a tapestry or something that could just be updated on and you could have a special webcam that was aimed at it. But I find the thing about a lot of political comedy, I've got to say, I mean, Jeff Norcott does it very well in terms of being kind of, Eurosceptic and putting the Leave case through comedy, and to be fair, the BBC do give him that platform on the MASH, is it called the MASH Report?
MASH Report,
yeah, with Nish Kumar, and that's he's a good slot, and that works well, and he has good chemistry with Nish. That it doesn't feel like jarring in that context. He's great, but the thing with a lot of political comedy is it's quite difficult actually to make good jokes live as a stand-up. That address any of the detail of policy, because people just haven't done the reading, and they've usually had a couple of beers, and they are they're going, is that right? Did you really say that? Is that they're parts of their mind. You can get that. It's much easier actually for somebody like Rod Liddle, to be honest, in The Spectator, to be funny about the insanity or the inanity of a particular new proposal.
Because the audience understands the nuance and has the knowledge.
Exactly, and exactly. You've got the time to absorb it. In stand-up, people tend to go for big characters, so it's much easier to go, Boris, big bumbling fucking buffoon, he's an idiot, isn't he? He's a bit of a fascist, isn't he? And then they'll all laugh because it's just very cartoonish.
Which brings us on to the next question. Is it compulsory for comedians to despise Donald Trump? It seems to be.
It does seem to be. I mean, again, American politics, I think that has been that's more extraordinarily cartoonish, but has been for some time. There's a guy called Norm Macdonald who's a very funny, and he's been around the block many times. Norm Macdonald is an American comedian, used to be on Saturday Night Live. He's had his own podcasts and radio shows and stuff. And I thought he hit the nail on the head. Somebody asked him, they said, is Donald Trump good news or bad news for comedy? He said, it's great news for bad comedians. Yeah. It's bad news for good comedians. Exactly. That's off, it's because it just, and George W. Bush was the same. There were loads of comedians who would just literally repeat his various strange manglings of the language, and I tended to agree that George W. Bush was a little bit alarming with some of his sort of, you think, how is his mind working beneath that? What I find really strange, though, is that there is no critical analysis of Trump whatsoever. They simply go straight to racist, sexist, homophobic, blah, blah, blah. And ignore the fact that, for instance, there has definitely been a significant calming of military activity around the world under his
the economy is doing pretty well.
The economy is doing fabulously. You don't know whether you give him full credit for that, but you certainly can't blame him for something that's gone well. And meanwhile, George W. Bush is now held up as this kind of elder statesman. 3 years into his administration, he had launched a disastrous war on two fronts that we're still feeling the ramifications of today. But, it's weird, this.
Do you think that at the heart of all of this, the disdain that Brexit is treated with and Donald Trump, that there is a class-based, a snobbery, an intellectual snobbery about it? It's like the serfs don't understand the nuance, and therefore they can be mocked. Not only the political figureheads, but the entire people behind them are basically a bit thick.
From the point of view of the stand-up comedy community, to the extent that it does have a coherent sort of community, thrust, I certainly don't think that's consciously intended, or even that many people are aware of it. I think there is a potentially a pitfall is the sort of unintended consequences of the sort of pivoting towards Remain Blairite kind of mentality that happened, as I say, during those years. Or in fact, if anything, you still needed to attack, any comedian needs to attack the government from the left. That seemed to be so you had to be to the left of Blair, What happened with Brexit was this, it was almost, I think of it like an iceberg, that just the whole political establishment suddenly just pivoted 180 degrees, and suddenly comedians found themselves on the side of the establishment. Yeah. You can't avoid that. The establishment wanted Remain, the courts wanted it, the Bank of England wanted it. I know the press was split, and there were many sort of scurrilous newspapers, no question about it, and the tabloids stoked up all the rest of it. But the bulk, the civil service wanted it, all of the great economic think tanks, they were all pro-Remain. That was the establishment, and the comedians wanted it. So suddenly, when 52% went, no, we don't want it, and they have demographically been demonstrated to be, what you might broadly call the working class, less often in, privileged with a tertiary education and so on. That does suddenly seem to be the, I don't think it's intended. But
there we have a great schism, don't we? Because like rock and roll, anti-establishment was always the position of, you mentioned Ben Elton, all those lot. It was always anti-establishment.
Yeah.
They were representing us, to the establishment, and now they are part of the establishment. It leaves, I guess, Brexiteers or those on the right, voiceless in this debate. I
think a lot of people do feel voiceless, and I think it's one thing to feel, the BBC's biased with Newsnight coverage, but in reality, both right and left seem to think that Newsnight is biased. Both right and left think that the Question Time is biased, and all the rest of it. I think they do a pretty good job, broadly speaking. I have some specific issues. But I don't think there could be much doubt that when they look at comedy and light entertainment generally, that they see a pro-Remain, pro-European mentality, a pro-European mindset. And it's sort of unavoidable in the same way that the problems we're having in Parliament are unavoidable because such an overwhelming majority of parliamentarians, of MPs, are Remain compared to their constituents. And I can see the argument for a representative democracy in which constituents vote for the best they want, and then, I can see the argument for not even having a referendum. I can see all of that. But now you've had one, that is the problem you have. And it's similar in television. The mindset of most people who work in television, not just the comedians, but the whole of the production infrastructure.
Let's try and put some numbers on that. So if we say that over there, Westminster, 75% Remain?
I think so, yeah.
In say, your average BBC studio, comedy studio, what's the ratio there?
I would say almost entirely, and I would say you might have a cameraman or something who might leave, and he would keep his mouth shut. I'm not saying it's like Stalinist. I'm just saying it's just a natural. It's very similar. You must be aware of the figures of the Democrat-Republican split in American Academy, right? The universities in America.
Yeah.
Some departments like humanities, anthropology, that kind of stuff. It's like 95% are stated Democrat, not just keeping it to themselves, but campaigning, wear badges, Democrats.
Okay.
And even in the wider more STEM fields or whatever, there is a significant, I would say TV in this country is in a similar.
So we talked about self-censorship in comedy, and another bête noire of yours I know is identity politics and campus culture. So putting all that to one side to conclude, what's the most offensive joke that you would be comfortable to? Where is that tipping point into the abyss of never working again? Like from a personal point of view, how far? Come on, what's your most offensive joke?
What in a live comedy setting?
Yes.
Oh, in a live comedy setting, I can say, especially now when I'm on tour, because people have come to see me, so I can say almost anything I want. But I am not inclined to do so. I really am not an offensive. Yeah. I might make little sort of asides, that kind of stuff, but it's not. I wouldn't kind of like finger jab. I really am not inclined to do so. So it's not my intention, and it would just be totally anathema to me to do that. But but nothing to do with the European referendum stuff. Yeah. But in my last show, Genius, the one you mentioned, which got the good reviews up in Edinburgh, I did that for 2 years in a row, Genius and Genius 2.0, and it was broadly speaking about dumbing down. It hadn't intended to be. I actually wanted to do a show about Da Vinci and Einstein and Turing and all these people and what was the nature of genius, but I found myself getting drifted. And I had this kind of finale where I had my favourite edition of the Guinness Book of Records growing up from 1973 and my son's edition from 2017, and I compared them. My one was just full of facts and figures and graphs and tabular demonstrations of increasing land speed records, whatever, and his one was just like a full colour picture of Adele, and that was basically it. She sold the most records. Or there were whole pages about who had the most successful Instagram accounts. I mean, just the craziness of celebrity and the vapid culture that's overtaken.
And out there was who's the fattest person.
Yes, exactly. And he might have been a 17th century oldie, and you might have a picture of him sitting on a cow. But there was a bit in that where I talk about intelligence and IQ and the idea that some people are more intelligent than others. That was a thing that was addressed and acknowledged and recognised in the Guinness Book of Records, and that's gone now. People won't address that.
It's too offensive.
That, frankly, they do find offensive, and that is absurd because that simply is biology. Good. Some people are more intelligent than others. And that in itself is considered to be an offensive
Now,
fact.
I'm going to stop you there, Simon,
Yeah.
before you never work again. Look, it's been great talking to you, mate. It's been tons and tons to think about. So, look, what a great edition. And carry on the conversation across all of our social media platforms now. How far is too far? Can we make jokes about anything? Or Brexiteers, the constant brunt? And send us the funniest jokes you've got about Remainers. It's your show. Over to you. Cheers.